1st, 2023 Eugene Planning Commission meeting. I'd like to call this meeting to order. My name is Dan Isaacson. I'm the chair of the Eugene Planning Commission. To begin the evening, I'd like to call on Commissioner Ramey to give the city's land acknowledgement statement.
Thank you. Since time immemorial, the Kalapuya people have been the indigenous stewards of our region, building dynamic communities, maintaining balance with wildlife, and enacting sustainable land practices. This land acknowledgement is a way of resisting the erasure of indigenous histories and to honor Native communities by inviting truth and reconciliation. Following treaties between 1851 and 1855, Kalapuya people were dispossessed of their indigenous homeland by the United States government and forcibly removed to the Coast Reservation in Western Oregon. As we consider the impacts of colonization, we also acknowledge the strength and resiliency of displaced indigenous people. The city of Eugene is built within the traditional homelands known as Kalapuya Ilihai. Kalapuya descendants are citizens of the Confederate tribes of the Grand Ronde Community of Oregon and the Confederate tribes of the Siletz Indians of Oregon. They continue to make contributions in our communities here and across the lands. We express our respect for the inherent political sovereignty of all federally recognized tribal nations and indigenous people who live in the state of Oregon and across the nation. Therefore, the Planning Commission recognizes that what we do today will affect the many generations who come after us.
Thank you, Commissioner Ramey. And thanks to everyone joining us in this hybrid meeting format. Today, our meeting will begin with public comment, followed by an update from the city implementation of the climate-friendly and equitable communities rules. There are several housekeeping announcements and instructions related to the meeting format that I need to take care of first. Thank you for your patience while we work through many of them. Anyone wishing to join us in this meeting can do so online by following the instructions listed on the agenda for this meeting. Planning Commission meetings can also be viewed by watching the live stream available on our website or on the broadcast Comcast Channel 21. For those who join the meeting via computer, device, or phone, your microphone, webcam, and phones are automatically muted when you enter the meeting as an attendee. If you wish to participate during the public comment portion of the meeting and haven't done so already, please raise your virtual hand now to join the speaker's queue in one of two ways. For those viewing the meeting on a computer, laptop, or other device, click once on the blue hand icon. For those listening to the meeting on a phone, press *9. Public comment is an opportunity for individuals to speak to the Planning Commission on topics except for the items scheduled for public hearing or public hearing items for which the record has already closed. As a reminder, your hand must be raised to be in the queue for public comment. Is there anybody waiting in the queue?
There's one.
Okay. We want to, I think we had to ask 3 times, right? Or are we just going to move on?
You could.
Okay.
No attendees.
Okay, no attendees.
Okay.
As always, feel free to contact staff if there are any comments you wish that you were not able to provide or wish to do so in a different manner. I will now close the public comment and ask for comments from other planning commissioners if they have any. Which hopefully we have any. Moving on to our next agenda item, I'd like to turn it over to Heather O'Donnell to begin our staff presentation on climate-friendly and equitable communities. Following the staff presentation, the commission will have an opportunity to ask questions.
Great, thank you. So, good evening, and we are back tonight to provide an update on the city's implementation of the new state rules called Climate Friendly and Equitable Communities, or CFEC. I'm Heather O'Donnell. I'm with the Planning Division, and I'll provide a short background on the rules. We gave the Planning Commission a more extensive background overview at your August 23rd work session. Also provide a general overview on CFEC implementation and the deadlines, and then we'll move into project updates with Reed Werner with the Building and Permit Services Division, who will provide an update on the parking reform project. Leah Rausch with the Planning Division will provide an update on climate-friendly areas, and Rob Innerfeld with Transportation Planning on scenario planning. All right, so starting with CFEC implementation overview. As a recap, Oregon has an adopted policy to reduce Oregon's climate pollution by 80% from 1990 levels by 2050. That's what the science calls for to avoid catastrophic impacts. Oh, sorry, just making sure it was showing right. Catastrophic impacts to the environment, communities, and the economy. By 2018, Oregon was far off track from the goal, particularly in reducing pollution from transportation, and Oregon is already experiencing real-world impacts of climate disruption. So on the chart you're seeing there, the brown line is, or if you can tell it's brown, the lower line is the goal for decreasing emissions by 2050, and the dotted blue line was the 2018 projections. In response, through executive order, Governor Brown directed state agencies to promote cleaner vehicles, cleaner fuels, and less driving, while also centering the needs of Oregon's most vulnerable communities. Following that executive order, the Oregon Land Conservation and Development Commission adopted this climate-friendly and equitable communities rules in July of 2022, which require changes to how we do transportation and housing planning. Since then, the newest projections show Oregon is closer to achieving its goal, due in part to recent legislation like CFEC. And so on that chart, the blue solid line is the 2022 projections. So that's good news. The state has also recently developed new dashboards to track our progress in meeting goals in 6 transportation categories. This shows the goals in the land use category, and those include, for example, reducing the rate of urban growth boundary expansion and for more households to be located in compact mixed-use neighborhoods. So parking reform and climate-friendly areas, which we'll hear more about tonight, are aimed at making progress on these land use goals. Implementation of these new rules will be a multi-year effort with multiple projects. So to help frame or guide the work, we have developed the following implementation goals. Comply with the climate-friendly and equitable communities rules. That's pretty important. Reduce greenhouse gas emissions from transportation and housing. Support more climate-friendly housing and transportation options. And center the voices of historically marginalized community groups in decision-making. So regarding that last goal, centering the voices of historically marginalized community groups throughout this process is intended to improve equitable outcomes in Eugene's transportation and housing, particularly for those who have been harmed by past planning, climate, and transportation decisions. These are the groups that are already identified in the state rules, and we added students and veterans for the Eugene area. So there are several projects that will need to be implemented, will need to be done to implement the new rules, and they generally fall into these 4 buckets. Parking, which includes parking reform and preparing for electric vehicle charging infrastructure. Climate-friendly areas, which is planning for some areas to have higher density housing coupled with more active transportation facilities that allow people to get around without a car. Climate-friendly transportation, which includes a big bucket of things, updates to the transportation system plan, implementing a preferred scenario plan to reduce greenhouse gases as we grow, and updating our bike parking requirements. And then finally, compact development, which includes updating the land use code for pedestrian-friendly and compact development standards. We're only talking about a couple of these tonight. So luckily, as we mentioned before, the CFEC goals align with other city work, such as the Climate Action Plan, Envision Eugene, the Housing Implementation Pipeline, and the Transportation System Plan, which includes strategies promoting compact development, making it easier to ride, roll, walk, or take transit, and to increase housing options and more equitable outcomes. So as an example, Eugene's 20-minute neighborhood concept is a broad strategy for people across the entire city to be able to access their daily needs without a car. Climate-friendly areas would be a subset of this, that is the higher density and more compact example of this kind of approach. So switching to public information, since this is a multi-year project spanning several city departments, we established a two-pronged approach for public involvement and communications across the projects. That is to, one, establish consistent and coordinated public information and communications, and two, develop project-specific public involvement plans that offer realistic, meaningful, accountable, and equitable engagement strategies, especially given our timelines, deadlines, and resources. A few of these pieces are already off the ground. So those include consistent branding between the different implementation projects. We have the city has a CFEC project webpage. And we have a CFEC Engage Eugene page, which is focused on broad outreach opportunities and information for the community. Public engagement for individual projects will be discussed later in the presentation as we go along. Oh, and this is social media. Can't forget that.
One more.
All right. So moving into timelines, when is this all due? So you may recall that the last time we were here, we discussed when the different implementation projects were due. This chart shows the timelines as currently identified in the rules. The diamond icons indicate a deliverable or a requirement that goes into effect. I'm not going to go over these in detail. They'll be covered a little bit more later, but just generally, parking reform and EVs have several requirements that go into effect this year, with policy changes to be completed by December of 2023. The climate friendly area study is due by December of 2023 also, and designation of the final climate friendly areas is due by December of 2024. Regional scenario plan, the regional scenario plan has some interim deadlines, and those lead up to adoption with the major TSP update. The major TSP update, including the scenario plan, walkability and compact development strategies, and bike parking standards are all due by December of 2026. However, since we last came to you, we recently confirmed that the rules do allow us to still request additional changes to these deadlines like we did for parking reform. So with that in mind, we are considering the proposed alternative deadlines, which are shown in the far right column, to reflect staffing capacity and really sync up our public engagement efforts through other work that's going on. The main shifts are aligning adoption of climate-friendly areas to be adopted as what's called a land use efficiency measure. We talked a little bit about that when we went over our work plan. So adopting climate-friendly areas with our UGB update in 2026, and then moving the major TSP update and everything that goes with that to 2029. And Rob will talk a little bit more about that under scenario planning. There's also activity at the state level that we are monitoring that could impact this work. There are legislative updates and temporary rules that are being considered. And there's also a pending appeal of the rules that's working its way through the process. So any high level questions before I hand it off to Reed to talk about parking reform?
I can't see behind me if there's anybody, but it doesn't appear to be.
All right.
Hey, as Heather mentioned, the first components of the CFEC rule changes to go into effect are the rules.
Pardon?
Commissioner Bailey.
Oh, Commissioner Bailey. Somebody's telling me.
I couldn't see, sorry.
There she is.
Yes. Can I ask a question now? Is that what you said?
Yes, please.
I wondered in that overview where the conversation fits about the 20-minute neighborhoods, definition of them and designation. I mean, if that's supposed to apply citywide, shouldn't there be some section or focus or information about it included in all of those other areas?
Yeah, so the concept for 20-minute neighborhoods is identified in Envision Eugene as a strategy. The way that is framed is that 90% of Eugene residents would live in a 20-minute neighborhood where they could access all of their daily needs within a 20-minute time frame without needing a car. And what I was trying to articulate is that climate-friendly areas are also in alignment with the 20-minute neighborhood concept. It's just they're a kind of a subset of that, where you would have higher density housing and higher density jobs. So more housing, more jobs than you might see in like a smaller neighborhood, 20-minute neighborhood center. So if you're thinking like downtown as the extreme example or the highest density example of a 20-minute neighborhood down to, your neighborhood store with maybe a couple of shops around it. So we do try to make that linkage. And I think Leah will talk a little bit more about that when we get to climate friendly areas, but we do try to make that linkage that we can use the climate friendly area project and requirements to move that concept forward, at least in some parts of the city. But it's not climate friendly areas, because they're supposed to be higher density, are not intended to be all over the city. Does that answer your question?
I think so. I'll see when we talk about it more later.
Okay.
And I do have one other question. You've made reference several places, both in the agenda and in the presentation materials, about centering the voices of marginalized groups, and you have that long list of the groups. And I'm wondering, I'm not accustomed to seeing the word center used as a verb. So I wonder exactly what you mean by centering the voices. And I particularly wonder how that will be accomplished in any of these areas.
Great question. Yeah, so the rules are specific about when and who to engage at minimum to help elevate historically marginalized groups in our transportation and housing planning processes. So like I said, that list that was there, that is actually directly from the rules. And then we added to it because it's not a limited to list. It's at least these groups and any other groups that that we have heard are historically marginalized or we don't hear a lot from in these processes. And so the rules indicate that there are different, depending on what kind of transportation or planning project you're working on, there are different ways and requirements around doing engagement. Equity engagement is the way that I think it's labeled. And so I think Leah will talk a little bit more about that with climate friendly areas, because it's very prescribed, the minimum requirements that you would be doing to address those provisions. And then as we go forward, there are things, I think Rob will talk a little bit about equity, transportation performance measures. Some of the outreach that we're doing for parking is trying to weave that in, even if it's not necessarily required in the rules. So it's really trying to get more get more information, both qualitative and quantitative, from historically marginalized groups to help. And I don't like the word ensure because we can't ensure anything, but to help avoid making transportation and housing policy decisions that are continuing the harm that has occurred to historically marginalized communities, like, you know, potentially approving a highway that goes through a historically marginalized, a neighborhood that's predominantly BIPOC or other historically marginalized groups. So trying to avoid continuing to make those, continuing to exacerbate the issue.
Thank you. Yes, I'll be interested in hearing more about how that is to be accomplished.
Yeah, and I think I will just say, not to put too much on Leah, I think we're still figuring that out, right? So that we haven't, these are new rules. We're still figuring out what they mean and what it means for the Eugene context. It's going to be different in different communities. So we're still figuring that out.
I have a question, a follow-up that'll be afterward as well. So I know that we're requesting a delay in 2 of these, one by 2 years and one by 3 years. And the graph that you showed earlier is actually not in the slide deck that was given to us ahead of time. So FYI.
The graph?
Oh, yeah.
Yeah.
The emissions chart.
Oh, the emissions chart, because it was animated. Yeah.
So I guess the question is, are there other municipalities that you're aware of in Oregon also see delays? Are we an outlier or?
No, there are other, yep, definitely.
That's what I expected.
Yeah.
So I guess the larger question I would have is if you go back to that slide.
This one or this one?
Oh, keep going. It shows all the drop off.
Oh, the chart.
Slope. Yeah. So we're at the dot at the top of the screen, and all of the graphs that go downward are projections based on everything that we're doing. So if a lot of us are delaying the start of this, what is the likelihood of hitting our 2050 goal if most people are doing delays by 2 and 3 years, where most of the work doesn't get started until the beginning? And that's where we start basically our genesis of it.
Yeah, I mean, I guess I could not answer that question from a modeling standpoint, but what I can say is that there are specific requirements that have come into effect and will continue to come into effect in the rules that we don't even have to adopt. And Reed's going to talk a little bit about that related to parking and not requiring minimums and EV conduit, you know, things like that have already come or are coming onto the books without us even doing anything. So some of the things that we're talking about extending in other jurisdictions are long range planning. I mean, you're right that we are adding a couple of years, but in the context of 2050, you know, I mean, I think we're hoping that it is better to do it right and take a little bit longer than it is to rush it just to meet a deadline that, you know, frankly, we gave comments on that we were unlikely to meet in the first place. Yeah, so.
Can't see behind me, so if there's anybody behind somebody,
It's
let me
just
know.
me. I don't know.
I think you can move on.
Great. Thank you for those questions.
Okay, jumping back into parking. It's the first component of the CFEC rule changes to go into effect. And these are the rules that impact how or if cities can require minimum off-street parking for developments and redevelopments of property. We provided an in-depth overview of the parking reforms at the Planning Commission work session in November of 2022. This
Can you move
portion,
your mic closer.
sure.
Thank you.
This portion of the presentation will provide a quick refresher on the rules, and then we'll cover an update on the ongoing public involvement piece of the project. So prior to the implementation of CFEC, the City of Eugene's land use code would require parking for development and redevelopment of properties based on specific ratios for the use type and the size of the use. We already had parking exempt areas in the code, like the downtown and West University areas. But in the remainder of town, Minimum off-street parking requirements were strictly enforced, which posed an obstacle for many developments. So why was parking included in the state's rule changes? First off, parking minimums make housing more expensive. It costs a lot to build parking spaces, and that cost usually ends up raising tenants' rents. During our ongoing housing supply and affordability crisis, we need to look at removing barriers to increasing the supply of housing, and mandated parking is one of those barriers. For instance, the average cost per new surface parking space is $5,000. The typical cost that renters pay for parking is around $142 per month, which leads to an additional 17% of a dwelling unit's rent cost that is attributed to parking. Another reason is the rules focus on parking is that surface parking takes up a lot of space that a property owner could choose to use for more housing or open space, including gardens, landscaping, and trees. Research has shown that after cities have made policy changes concerning parking minimums, developers invested in more mixed use and affordable housing project as a result of the reduced costs from removing parking. Additionally, just having an abundance of available parking incentivizes driving, even when we could walk, bike, or take the bus. So here's a rundown on the timeline for the parking reform actions. The first changes kicked in automatically at the end of last year and impact how or if the city can require off-street parking for new developments. The EV charging capacity rules took effect after March 31st. And by the end of this year, we are required to adopt a land use code amendment that implements the rest of the parking reform by choosing one of three options.
Whoops.
The first parking changes went into effect for development permits submitted as of the 1st of this year. The biggest change is that the city can no longer require off-street parking for any property located within 1/2 mile of a frequent transit corridor. And a frequent transit corridor is defined as transit lines that have 4 or more stops per hour at peak times. We are also limited to requiring no more than 1 parking space per residential unit when there are 2 or more dwellings on a single lot. So think middle housing with this one. There's also a list of specific uses that are now exempt from parking requirements, including childcare facilities, affordable housing, domestic violence shelters, and dwelling units smaller than 750 square feet. The next change that took effect are the EV charging rules. For some context, starting July of 2022, the state building code requires that 20% of all new parking spaces built for commercial or multi-unit residential developments be served by EV charging conduit. CFEC increased that requirement to 40% of new parking spaces built for multi-unit residential and mixed unit developments that have that multi-unit component. The rules do not apply to commercial only developments, so they'll be still at the 20%. This state rule took effect for development permits submitted starting April 1st, 2023, and it must also be included in the land use code amendments that must be effective by the end of this year. So we presented the specific details of the parking reform options last November and are currently working on getting feedback from the community on a preferred option. We're about half a month into the public engagement so far, and we've had interviews with stakeholders so far, so we've got some really good feedback from the community, and we're ready to kind of take the engagement community-wide over the next month here. But just to summarize the options again, option 1 is to remove all minimum off-street parking requirements citywide. We are already working on draft code that would comply with option 1. It's the most straightforward option, and the same rules would apply for the entire city. This option would allow for all property owners and developers to decide whether they want to devote space to off-street parking or some other use. It also allows cities to explore other parking reforms that would mitigate potential issues caused by developments that don't provide parking. Options 2A and 2B require a list of other specific parking reform regulations. These options would entail having different parking reform rules for different areas of the cities. The specifics involved in implementing either option 2 are quite detailed. Additionally, the state's proposed temporary rule amendments that were just published last Tuesday modified a few of these options. So we're still trying to grasp exactly what the effects of that will be. But we would be happy to answer any questions that you have about additional requirements associated with choosing either option 2A or 2B. The state's deadlines for parking specifically didn't leave much time for this project, but we did receive approval to push the deadline for the land use code amendment by 6 months to the end of this year, which allowed time to focus on some meaningful public involvement. We have contracted with Julie Fisher, a land use consultant, to assist with the public involvement portion of the project, and have already started the process by conducting focus interviews with key stakeholders. We'll also be hosting in-person focus group forums and participating in public outreach events over the next month. And we'll also have an info session open to the general public that will be hosted over Zoom in early May. An online survey just went live earlier this week, and we have already received 76 responses to the survey as of just earlier today. Now for the next steps in the parking project. We'll be back at the June 13th work session to discuss the feedback we received from the public involvement, and then we'll be at the June 27th public hearing to present the draft land use code amendment. Following that meeting, the Planning Commission will have the opportunity to make recommendations to the City Council on a preferred option and or course of action. And now open any questions on the parking reform project. Commissioner Pergolett.
Sure. Can we go back to slide 17, please, which is the transit map for the corridors?
This is hard to show in a presentation. We have a larger version of this map on our website, and you can actually zoom into tax map specific.
Right. I can see it fine on my computer. Thank you. So the thing I'm wondering about is that this is based on the number of transit trips, correct?
Yeah, it's any corridor identified in blue there has at least 4 transit stops at a peak time.
So is this going to change over time based on the fact that there may be changes to transit service provided? And how will we deal with that?
Definitely. And that's another part of the draft changes that just came out. Prior, the rules had been silent about it, but now they're saying that every year we would check out the transit corridors and then have to adopt a new map that is based on how the transit lines had changed in that past year.
And so when somebody fills out an application for a permit, how would we identify where they fall if it changes during the time that they're constructing or building?
It definitely adds some challenge, but fortunately with the direction of that, we only have to do it every year. We would probably get that just a reoccurring thing where we get advice from LTD and then are able to map it. And we have probably an admin order or something like that that would implement the changes to the map for that specific year.
It would actually have to be a code amendment every year. So
Every
Correct.
year,
Yeah,
right?
yeah.
Every year. So
if there is a change, right? So it's only when there is a change, whether adding or subtracting. Also, Lydia, correct me if I'm wrong, but if somebody submits a permit, we're going to go with what the code says on the day they submit their permit. So we're not going to change the rules.
okay, I would have assumed that also. Is it possible for us just to adopt corridors and have it be done, or are we going to always have to change it?
Well, the other thing is if we go citywide, so if we go option 1, we won't need to adopt this map. We won't have to worry about the corridors because it will be the same citywide. That would be easier, right?
Okay, got it.
Commissioner
Good point.
Commissioner Beeson.
I have a similar question or maybe a follow-up on. And I understand if we go option 1, that this is kind of moot or we wouldn't be using this. I'm also thinking it's good to pay a bit of attention to it at the end of the day. Even if we recommended option 1 and the council ended up doing this option, and I'm thinking back to middle housing, we may end up with something like this. My question is, when I look at this, and I had a similar question in August, I've read the regulations, and I've even tried to find, I guess, some of the findings or some of the guidance that the state is beginning to prepare. I've found my way through some of that. When I look at this map, I understand it's driven by where LTD has the 4 stops per hour transit. But I look at some of this, having basically grown up in Eugene and lived in most parts of it. When I look at, for example, that it kind of stops out at Coburg and Harlow, And in my mind, and this goes kind of to Lisa's question too, or to Commissioner Fraggle, is I find myself thinking, gosh, it really ought to extend on out Covert Road to, I don't know, Beltline or to Crescent or somewhere.
When we checked with LTD, that was one of the areas that they were looking into expanding transit to.
Yeah, can I just jump in real quick? So the reason why it's that section is that there's 2 overlapping bus routes, the number 12 that goes down up to Harlow and Gateway, and then the 66 and 67, which are loops that go over to Valley River Center. And they're probably like on 20-minute rather than 15-minute frequencies in the peak hours. So they're probably close. LTD is going to be doing a process later this year called the Comprehensive Operations Assessment, where they're going to be re-looking at how analysis.
Okay.
Someone is telling me nodding whether I get things right or not. So anyway, there'll be like a community conversation about how frequent should the buses be on some of these different major corridors. So there'll be an opportunity to talk about that kind of thing.
Okay, I want to say a couple of other things about it. That's good. That's good to know. You know, and I kind of think it's good if there was community conversation about it, or we were able to kind of think through it a bit. So when I think of this, like going on out Covert Road feels like an area where you might want to have something like this. And I'm finding myself, and I'm looking at, say, Cal Young Road going across or Crescent going across. I look in the whole South Eugene area, there's really nothing going on out in the 29th or 29th and Jefferson. I can sort of, you know, list a few of these areas that seem like they would be candidates for where we'd want to have that sort of transit and have that kind of access. And when I read in here, when we talk about planned access going into the future, and we talk about the CFAs, and there's different wording that you guys use in there. We talk about access needs able to access needs without a car, and how we're going to plan all that. And a lot of it kind of comes back to LTD and how they've set up the routes. And I understand maybe, you know, if there's conversations, they can change those, that'd be good. So I find myself thinking, I guess I'm wanting to know if there's any opportunity for us to maybe set some of these, or even to consider that as we go forward. Is any flexibility in the rules that we could, you know, we could be more, I guess, aggressive about it, or we could be more, we could reach out in the community more in areas and try to identify these zones. And the last part of it would be, I find myself also wondering, what is the involvement of LTD in this multi-year process as we go forward and we're doing all this? How are they involved in this?
I'll let the other project managers where that comes up more specifically, unless Reed, you have anything with parking.
No, for parking, the only thing we do is just consult with LTD to find out where those transit corridors are that reach that definition. And then the state is very prescriptive that we cannot require parking minimums in those areas specifically. We could always expand on that. If we do decide to go for option 2A or 2B, we could decide to not require parking in additional areas of the city. That would be an option, but we would be limited to never providing or requiring parking in those transit corridors.
Okay.
Yeah, and I'll just add, I think for the climate friendly areas, I can speak to that a little bit more. How we could do some future planning related to transit based on where those climate friendly areas are.
Okay.
And I think LTD should be a partner in this. There's a few different places, certainly in the transportation planning work, that's a little bit later in the process though.
Okay.
Commissioner Lear?
Yeah, I know there were a lot of issues brought up in our last discussion regarding the administrability of 2A and 2B and the amount of staff time and general resources it would take to try to implement it. And it seems, as you brought to our attention, the issue regarding the annual updates due to the changes in transit seems like it could be particularly onerous. I'm curious if there's any sense as to how much time that would actually take, you know, each year, assuming that there were changes to make those updates. And additionally, I remember in the last conversation, there was a request to take a look at whether we were more interested in 2A or 2B. And I think the consensus was more directed toward the first option for, universally eliminating the parking requirements, but I'm curious if much staff time has gone to drafting on 2A or 2B, or the focus has just remained on the first option.
We've definitely been working on concepts for how we would implement 2A and 2B. Fortunately, we didn't go too far down that road because, like I said previously, the temporary rules did just come out last week that changed a lot of the details of the two options. For instance, if you recall, option 2A required us to choose 3 out of 5 different components. 2 of them were related to unbundling. One was a tax on commercial parking lots. One was a commute benefit for large employers. And then one was a limit on multi-unit housing parking requirements. That was 3 requirements, or 3 of those that we had to pick before. They reduced it down to 2. So that you could potentially work a little more with that. We don't have to pick one of the unbundling options. We could do the commute benefits. We could look into limiting multi-unit. That does make that slightly more feasible now. And coincidentally, they also added unbundling to option 2B. So they made 2B more complicated because now one of the requirements was to designate a neighborhood where we manage on-street parking. And now we have to choose between managing on-street parking or unbundling parking citywide as a part of 2B. So we haven't really been able to scope out what it would look like to draft those code at this point, but we are developing concepts for how it would fit within the code. For instance, the unbundling concept, we have to look at both the residential code or the residential tenant code, and then also the land use code. So it's not exactly sure how that would work, but we're trying to develop concepts based in case we get some sort of feedback from the community and the planning commission that that's one of the directions we want to go in. We will definitely be ready to draft some code that would comply with those different options.
I'll just add something I thought that was interesting in the DLCD's temporary rules is that they specifically call out that no one in Oregon has implemented this unbundling policy. And that's part of the reason they wanted to add some flexibility to say, actually, there's a lot of unknowns here. So it's something we're going to prioritize in our public involvement, is just thinking about implications of that and kind of the response in the community to what that could look like.
I actually had one additional question too, which was, has there been any data collected on the extent to which the market or lenders are going to require parking? Or is there any bit of information that could be provided to us to help understand what would be included kind of naturally in option 1 in terms of, you know, percentage of buildings that require new parking according to their lenders, or any other data that could be collected?
So far, as we've had a handful of interviews with stakeholders in the community, that is the direction we've received, is that they're still going to be building parking based on market and other demands. It was really not the city's minimums that determined exactly how much parking was built in most developments. For instance, out in like the Delta Ridge areas where it's a ways away from transit, we did an analysis of what the new multi-unit developments that have gone in there have looked like, and they built twice as much parking as the city code would require. So it really comes down to those market factors. And whereas on the alternative, if they're downtown, if they're near university, if they make the determination that their tenants aren't going to be as likely to need cars, they're more likely to build less parking. Like one of the new 12-story developments going in over by campus is only providing, I believe, 7 parking spaces on the site, because they've determined that there is sufficient areas for people to store their cars in that region or in that area, because it's mostly going to be college students there anyway.
Thank you.
Thank you. My question, I'm looking at, I don't know what slide it is. Oh, 18. The rules that went into effect as of January 1st, would those then become superseded by whatever is adopted at the end of, you know, the option 1 or A or B on number 2?
So 1 would remove all parking minimums
Right.
anyway, so it would basically wash over that one. Whereas if we chose either option 2, those specific uses would still be exempted from parking requirements. Just 2A or 2B would add on to additional exemptions.
Okay. So option A would then basically kind of nullify those, because
Yeah.
I'm sorry, option 1.
Yeah.
Thank you. Okay. Thank you.
Commissioner Ramey.
Thank you. So I have a couple of questions. Well, one question, one comment. Did you say that the state requires us to follow LTD? In other words, LTD sets the routes and then we respond to what they do?
Well,
Is that-
yeah,
is that
I
what you
mean,
said?
the state just defines what a frequent transit corridor is, and
Okay.
so then we check with LTD.
So they didn't send, so then we check with LTD because who's gonna say, okay, so
Yeah.
it's an interesting policy situation where you have two different, I'm not sure which is the right analogy, the tail and the dog or the chicken and the egg, but there's some possibility to get really disconnected here and dysfunctional. So working closely with LTD and creating it so that it's systematic or systemic. So it's every year. So it's like hand in hand all the time, I think is crucial, not just when we start, but then as we continue. I know we do some of that now, but I think a lot of times we've depended on the land use to really make the transit corridor flourish, which is, you know, if you build it, they will come. So well, we'll build a bus there after you build it there. Well, this is sort of turning that around a little bit. So it's interesting. So the other one is about when we did that housing thing, what was it called again? Don't get old. Middle housing. Thank you. Middle housing. We waited a little bit to see what the community felt about their priorities. And I presume we're doing that with this process as well. So we'll have some feedback about 1 versus 2A, 2B. And when do we get that? When do you think that feedback comes back to us?
So we just put the survey live this week, and that's going to be running throughout the rest of this month, probably into early May. I think we want it to have up for a month, and that coincides with the time that we're having a number of outreach events and focus groups. So there will be a report that will be written up after we go through this, and then we'll present that at that June 17th work session when we come back here. Unfortunately, with the timing of having to come for a public hearing at the end of June, we'll already have to have option 1 draft code to the DLCD by then. However, if we're getting reports from the public engagement that it's a very strong push for the other options, we'll already be pivoting and trying to work on those code concepts and figure out how to draft those other options by that point.
Good luck.
Put myself in the queue real quick. And I might be completely off base here, but help me out. Has there any thought about combining the two together? In other words, it just seems odd that if I'm putting my developer hat on for a moment and try to do that, the developing needs of far west Eugene, far north Coburg, far north River Road, and the university area are completely different, right? What the type of person you're building the house for, the type of family that's moving in there, the neighborhood style, the culture of that particular neighborhood, totally different. So it is, I love the idea that we don't have to go back from a policy perspective and do new pieces of policy every year. That's great, but that also the upside of that coin, the other side of that coin is that now we're assuming that everybody has the same developmental needs. So I would argue, or at least posit that the response from folks would be that there are huge swaths of the city where you could jumble that together, but there are areas where there's higher density where we do want to have a little bit more regular control or regular oversight on a yearly basis. So is there a way to mold options 1 and 2A and 2B where we're going to have this whole swath over here? We're going to remove all the parking requirements, but then we're going to drill down on these particular areas to make sure, because again, this is all predicated on a theory that if we remove these requirements, people are going to build more housing and it's going to be cheaper. And that's a big assumption. And so to just kind of hand over the entire city to folks on that assumption with no check and balance makes me nervous.
So if we don't go with option 1 and remove parking mandates citywide, we're left with only those 2 other options of complying with 2A or 2B, and they're pretty specific about what choices we have for going for one or the other. We can always add additional regulations, not requiring off-street parking, but we can look into things like having more parking management areas where on-street parking spaces in residential neighborhoods are permitted and are limited in time so that there isn't going to be that overflow of on-street parking from developments that don't provide parking. We can look at alternatives to try to incentivize things that would mitigate some of the issues that might be caused with the lack of required parking. However, if we don't go with option one, we're limited to choose either 2A or 2B. We have to go with one of those two choices.
It just my gut and experience is that if someone has the ability to make $2 when they can make $1, they're going to choose $2. And there needs to be some method by which the people, if we're going to be giving a gift to them, ensures that we get a communal benefit out of it in response. That'd be my only feedback. If I think you had a second.
I'm gonna withdraw mine. That's okay. Go ahead.
It should be sense.
EV charging. I think you were talking about that. So a question on that. As we've gone through this over time, I've seen provide conduit as the requirement in the various housing applications. And then more recently, it's become provide electric service. And for me, those are kind of two different things. And maybe they mean the same thing. Can you clarify for me the requirement? Would it mean that these should be, let's say, plug-in ready? Or is it just conduit under parking lots and driveways and wire it up in the future?
Yeah, it's just going to be the conduit. So just the pipes under the parking spaces. And the code is written, says to serve 40% of parking spaces required. So that's why the service or that connotation comes up. But yes, it's just the pipes. It's to have the capacity. So down the line, when there are more EVs on the road, that there will actually be the capacity to hook up new charging stations rather than having to dig up and rebuild parking.
So the down the line part is, there's really nothing certain on that. That's just kind of a function of when we get more electric cars out there and a bigger need. That's kind of a future code.
Yeah, that's the intent of the state rules.
Okay.
So now, sorry, now I have a follow-up to that. So building a parking lot, my requirement would be that I have a hookup, a place to physically plug in, but inside of that conduit, there's no requirement that that be a live connection.
It's just the pipes that are under the parking lot, just so that when there's more of a demand for electric vehicle charging stations, that they'll be able to install the station without having to tear up the parking lot and then rerun those cables to connect each one of the stations.
Is there anything inside the code that verifies that there's power to be able to support that load, like 3-phase power and that kind of thing?
No, that's nothing in CFEC about that specifically, but it's something that I know we're all trying to figure out as we're ramping up the demand on electric vehicles.
So if I have a lot and I build, a space for, 10 spaces and I'm required to have 40%. So four of those spaces are going to have a conduit and a plug. There's nothing in the code that says that someone's made sure that the power pole has the ability to support the conduit I've just built.
So there's no plugs in the requirement. It's just to have the pipes that will then eventually have the cable that will be connected to it.
Can I just add really briefly? I think part of the issue is that the LCD staff may have wanted to recommend more along those lines, but I think they were limited in what they were allowed to do in the land use arena that LCDC writes rules within. And our building official could maybe tell us more about that.
To be clear, I am not the building official.
Sorry. Okay.
Building
You just got nominated for the meeting.
Building and permit services. I think if I understood part of your question, that about the loads, the answer is yes, right? We have electrical inspectors and our plans examiners will review for that. In terms of, right, if there's enough load to.
Well, my question is, if you're building a space that has a spot for 4 vehicles, it's going to be an X, Y, and Z, and those 4 vehicles could at most draw on X number of power, right? And there is either Y number of power available from the nearby pole, or there's not. And if there isn't, then you could have a scenario where we built the underground piping and the conduit and for that load, but the power supporting network can't support it. And then without requiring the power company to upgrade the power, or the owner of that property who's upgrading the conduit to ensure that there's enough power there eventually in the future, should they want to use it, we will have pipes with conduit that are connected to power that doesn't have enough power to power a car.
I'm not sure.
I think, can I make?
Yes,
Yeah.
please.
Okay, so the conduit is installed and it runs out to the parking lot.
Yeah.
Then through
And-
plans examination or building inspection, one of the two,
Both.
it's going to be assured that the development, that the source of power on the site is
Both.
sufficient to
That's what I was looking
support the
Yes.
future charging stations.
That's what I was looking for. Okay. Yeah.
That's it.
That's the building.
Is that right?
There you go.
And we can follow up with additional clarification on that, to kind of suss this out a little bit more, but I want to make
But
sure.
I think, Commissioner Rain
That
is
is it.
absolutely correct in how that would work.
Okay, good.
Okay, I'm gonna move us on.
Well, okay.
Oh,
I'll try to be really quick. So in option one, there's nothing that would prevent us from instituting strategies to prohibit spillover parking. You mentioned residential parking zones, for example. So we could add on top, so we could do option one, and then we could go back and look at where there's spillover situations are, and we could create residential parking zones. That nothing, we could do that.
Yes, that's exactly the case. We're also, the survey was crafted in a way to kind of get at some of these mitigation strategies as well. So we're hoping to get some better idea of what's going to be a popular options going down the line if we do go with option one.
Lots more to come on parking in June.
we're not having parking go first next.
Well, thank you all. Good evening. So my name's Leah. I'm a relatively new commissioner in the planning division. So thank you all again for having me. So we're in the pretty early stages of the second component of the CFAC rules, which is the designation of the climate friendly areas or CFAs. So Heather talked a little bit about this already, but climate friendly areas are really just a new tool, a new name for the city to encourage more dense housing development in areas that are well served by transit and active transportation facilities in alignment with our vision within Envision Eugene. So what do the rules kind of say that climate friendly areas are? So they're urban mixed use centers that contain or are planned to contain a mixture of high density housing, jobs, businesses, and services. So by designating a climate friendly area, Eugene is basically saying that we'll update our housing and transportation plans to make sure that these areas have continued improvements to make it easier and safer for people to walk, bike, and take transit. We'll reduce minimum off-street parking requirements, and then also introduce strategies to avoid or minimize displacement and increase affordable housing options. And so there was a question earlier about centering historically marginalized community groups. I'll just say within the climate friendly areas, a lot of that is centered on looking at displacement and how we can mitigate displacement. There are also some specific requirements for suitability, capacity, and land use policies within climate friendly areas. So they basically can't be narrow corridors. So they have to be at least 750 feet wide, which in Eugene is about 2 blocks, and 25 acres in total is kind of the minimum size. Collectively, our climate friendly areas will have to accommodate 30% of our current and future housing needs. That's a theoretical zoned capacity, which we can get into later if we want. The climate friendly areas will also have to be kind of ready for this increased intensity of development, and that'll include looking at infrastructure capacity. So what does the process look like? So we've kind of broken up the climate friendly areas requirements into 3 parts. So first is the study. So this year in 2023, we'll identify all of our potential and study the most promising locations for climate friendly areas across the city. So Kearns and West is a consulting firm that's helping us to develop a community engagement plan, and they will kind of guide us through, that plan will guide us through the designation process. And as I said, an important part of the study and then our future engagement as well will be to identify any displacement risk that could come from CFA designation and look at strategies to prevent or mitigate that displacement. Our second step will be the designation or adoption process. So that will start in early 2024. That will include broader public involvement, a recommendation from you all as the Planning Commission, and then a decision from council to actually identify what our climate friendly areas will be. This designation will require revisions to the code, as well as an adoption of a climate friendly areas component to our comprehensive plan. So we expect that will be 2 new chapters on housing and compact development in the next couple of years, as well as revisions to the transportation system plan, which we'll talk plenty more about with Rob. And then, as Heather mentioned earlier, our intent is to kind of adopt this whole package of the plan and code amendments alongside our urban growth boundary analysis in 2026. So finally, CFA designation won't be static. We'll continue a process of kind of evaluating and increasing our climate friendly areas. As Heather mentioned, they'll serve as an efficiency measure in our UGB analysis. So one of many strategies for more compact development within our current UGB. Every time we revisit the UGB, we'll revisit our climate friendly areas designation, and we'll be required to kind of maintain that 30% zoned capacity of our current and future housing need. So most of what I want to talk to you about is that first stage, the climate friendly areas study. So we're using kind of a narrowing approach within the study. So we started by looking citywide at all potential locations that could serve as CFAs. And then we're kind of narrowing it down to our top candidates through kind of an iterative process that looks at all of the criteria that are in the rules. So the first step of our narrowing approach was to kind of cast a wide net. So at this stage, our potential climate friendly areas looked at where our urban centers currently exist or are planned based on zoning, where we already have good transit access and relatively high quality walking and biking access, and then where we're basically allowed to do development under Goal 7, which is hazard protections. Our next step that we're in the process of now will focus on kind of 2 different, more in-depth technical analyses. So one will be a suitability and capacity analysis that will look at whether our kind of most promising areas can achieve those housing capacity requirements, as well as what required policy changes would be required through or be necessary to designate the area as a climate-friendly area based on the state requirements. The second piece of that is the anti-displacement analysis. So helping us to understand how climate-friendly area designation could increase displacement pressure and what tools we have available to us to mitigate that risk. Through kind of the spring and early summer, LCOG is contracted to do the technical analysis. So they will deliver us their kind of final draft of the CFA study in June. And then we'll have some time through the second half of the year to make refinements as needed, whether based on doing more engagement or more internal analysis from different city departments on mitigation strategies, for example. The final study itself is due to DLCD in December. In the study, we are not required to include kind of a final preferred CFA configuration. Really, we just have to kind of analyze our most promising areas. But we may or may not be ready to kind of recommend our preferred climate-friendly areas by the end of this year. So along with that technical analysis, we're doing starting our public involvement process. So I mentioned we're working with Kearns and West to develop a community engagement plan that will help us to achieve the state requirements for an engagement-focused equity analysis. We've also, as Heather mentioned, launched our public information campaign, and then we started with 10 interviews with community-based organizations that represent those historically marginalized community groups to just inform our engagement plan and what our next steps might look like. Starting really in the spring and rolling into the summer, we're going to focus our engagement on working with historically marginalized community groups to better understand kind of generally housing and transportation needs, but digging into those concerns, potential concerns around displacement risk. We are working to coordinate with Reed's team on parking reform, as well as the city's transportation planning team to kind of coordinate our outreach events and engagement work as much as we can this year. So we'll be co-hosting a series of listening sessions with historically marginalized community groups to better understand displacement risk, housing, and transportation needs, and that'll be in coordination with transportation planning. We're also planning to participate in a series of outreach events, and our focus will just be kind of introducing the concept of climate-friendly areas as we're still working through the study, and then beginning some of those conversations about displacement. In the fall, we'll bring our proposed community engagement plan back to you all for approval. And that plan will kind of steer our broader public involvement through the kind of designation and adoption phase. And then our future public involvement strategy, or that plan, will really be pretty resource dependent. So we expect to kind of continue making updates to that. We don't know yet if the state will be providing any additional consultant support or funding to actually do that work. So kind of our most immediate next steps through the spring. So LCOG is working to complete the technical analysis, which is the basis for a study that they'll deliver in June. And then staff kind of concurrently will be working on developing those mitigation measures that may be appropriate to reduce displacement risk. Our listening sessions I mentioned with transportation planning will take place in May and June, and those may continue forward as there's interest and capacity by our community partners. And then also by June, Kearns and West will develop that draft community engagement plan for the designation and adoption process. And as I said, we may continue to revise that through the end of the year, just based on what we know about our available resources, and that will come to you in the fall. So with that, I will open it up for questions.
Commissioner Freckler.
Like that was like a mirror there. So the goal of the climate friendly areas is to have these, you know, vibrant, dense neighborhoods where people are walking, biking, and they can meet all their needs, right? So when we're selecting them, or we're, you know, identifying the most promising areas, I feel like it could go one of two ways, right? We could choose an area that we're like, oh, we're 3/4 of the way there in this one. Let's pick that one. It'll be easy. Bingo. Or we could select an area that seems like it has the a lot of potential, but would require a lot more effort and development of infrastructure capacity, development. So which option are we going to use? Are we going to go kind of like the one that seems already we're a good chunk of the way there? Or are we going to be looking for capacity to really create change in our community?
It's a great question. And I think that that is a policy decision that we will all have to make in the future. I don't think we have made any sort of decision in the study process. Like I said, we're taking that narrowing approach. So looking all the way across the city. It is somewhat dependent right now on our existing zoning. So it's not saying like, let's totally rezone a neighborhood. At least we haven't gotten to that place at this point. We're looking at kind of existing commercial areas, existing higher density residential areas, our transit corridors, right? So, but I think that's it's a great question, and something we'll have to figure out is there's some probably easy answers in this, and some that would require a lot more thinking about displacement risk, a lot more thinking about necessary investments that would need to be made in addition to just designating something as a climate friendly area, and writing it into our land use code is different than it actually becoming a vibrant area. So it's a good question.
I hope it's something that we'll seriously be thinking about as we go through the process. That I feel like the intention of this legislation is to help move urban communities in a direction that might potentially be challenging to get urban communities to move in. And so I'm hoping that, as we go through this, and I completely get that it's a policy decision, but that we'll approach it from a transformative mindset rather than status quo mindset.
Yeah.
If I could, go ahead.
Oh, I was just going to add one more thing that kind of in that vein that I'm excited about is that we also have the potential to designate secondary climate friendly areas, which have a somewhat lighter level of intensity in the development standards, But that might be a tool that we could use in more of those neighborhood centers to say, okay, we're not expecting to build 12-story buildings here, but we are saying that we want to invest more in this area and maybe increase the intensity as a neighborhood center. And whether climate-friendly areas is the right tool to do that, I think is something we're talking about internally.
Yeah,
I'm guessing that's where
what I
you're
was gonna
going.
add, yeah. Yeah, and also that was part of the reason that in the study and the displacement analysis, we are casting, I mean, we're looking at the whole city rather than starting small. You could just start with downtown and then add on to it, like you said. But we're not doing that because there's some good information that could come out of this work, particularly with the engagement and the displacement analysis. And so like Leah said, even if, you know, there could be areas that are identified for further investment through a different tool or 20-minute neighborhoods as a broad approach rather than as this box of climate-friendly areas and what that means. So that's one thing I think that's really exciting is that we're trying to leverage climate-friendly areas requirements to help us with other work, not just using our other work to help us with climate-friendly areas. We're trying to make this kind of go both ways.
Yeah, and just one last thing is that's why we're proposing to adopt them with the UGB analysis is they're one tool among many that we can look at it, encouraging more compact development across the city.
Thank you.
Sure.
Thank you. My first question is what defines an area when we're talking about climate friendly areas? I'm curious about like what geographically defines it as an area. Is it a neighborhood? Is it a census tract? I mean, what is an area?
Yeah. So there are those minimum size requirements, which
Okay.
is the 750 feet wide and 25 acres.
Okay.
We shouldn't have any problem getting larger than 25 acres in our city, but we'll have to achieve that 30%
Right.
current and future housing need to determine how much area we need to designate as a climate friendly area. They don't have to be bound to a neighborhood. They don't have to be bound to a census block group or a tract. They can be a boundary that we determine makes sense.
Yeah.
Similar to like drawing the downtown boundary, it'll just be kind of a designated area by blocks.
Okay.
Mm-hmm.
I just have one quick follow-up. Curious, knowing how much our community loves change, loves it. I'm curious about how, as I think about this process and how it kind of plays out, knowing that these areas are being identified for more intense development standards. And I'm imagining that it will become pretty controversial in some areas where, you know, folks that happen to reside in those areas kind of want to leave things the way they are. I'm curious as to how we're thinking about weighing the data, you know, whether like we're looking at buildable lands in a certain area, how much development potential is actually here and how close is it to things? I'm kind of curious about how are we thinking about weighing data over, you know, the public input, because I know that's a really important component. However, I think that, you know, it would be easy to identify an area and have an army show up and not want that to be designated. And I'm just kind of curious as to if we've really given thought to whether or not it's going to be data driven or.
No, I think it has to be both, right? I mean, it's definitely, we're in kind of the data analysis part of the process, but there will be extensive public involvement that happens. And as Heather mentioned, the rules do look at how we can center communities who have typically not been involved in land use decision making or who have been actively harmed by our land use planning in the past and often currently. So that's something we're really focusing on from the start, is working with those groups, but there will definitely be broader public involvement. And once we get closer to understanding what those promising areas are, doing more location specific public involvement with those neighborhoods. looking at like downtown in particular, right? There's not going to be much change between what's already in our code for downtown versus what a climate friendly area requires. So it also depends how much change we're looking at for that area, what's in their current zoning. And we'll see, but yeah, it's a good question.
Thank you.
Mm-hmm.
You got Commissioner there.
Commissioner Lear?
Yeah, I'm just curious, kind of a little bit in response to what Commissioner Edwards mentioned, and I anticipate some controversy here, obviously. But is there any way to summarize or quantify the data and the feedback received so far, for example, from the survey outreach? What was that targeted toward?
So the survey that's out right now is specific to parking. It is not focused on climate friendly areas at this point. We have not started broad public engagement yet for climate friendly areas. We're starting by targeting those historically marginalized community groups, and then we'll be starting kind of I would say a soft launch of kind of public involvement around climate friendly areas this spring, going to some outreach events, getting people familiar with what it is, what the designation means, before we even start rolling out any sort of like, here's where our potential climate friendly areas are and any mapping. So we haven't done that level of public involvement to share back yet. The community engagement plan that we bring to you all in the fall will be a lot more detailed around exactly how we want to roll this out to the community, start more of that broad and wide public involvement. That will really be our focus in 2024 and moving forward. Right now, we're just kind of setting the groundwork and starting on the technical analysis.
Thank you. In your sense, I guess I'm asking you, now you've had since August to think about this.
Since October. That's when I started.
Okay. Fair enough. I mean, I'm not sure that the city can't meet this requirement already, but do you have a sense of what that is? I mean,
I think that's a great point, and I think it gets to Commissioner Fragala's comment, is that we could take a pretty obvious route and say we're going to designate downtown, maybe some areas around downtown. Heather would have a better sense on the capacity analysis, how close we are to that 30% requirement with just looking at downtown. But I think we wanted to look citywide to say, okay, we have the obvious route, and we also want to think about what this tool could do outside of downtown and think maybe more creatively about what this tool could look like outside of that really obvious path. But Heather, I know, looked at the initial capacity analysis, just looking at downtown, right?
We did, you know, the rules changed a lot from when we first were looking at what the capacity would be downtown. It's not a buildable lands capacity. It's not find that vacant land in your partially vacant land and then figure out how much housing you could fit on there. It's that theoretical zoned capacity that Leah was talking about. So you're kind of putting blinders on and saying, okay, has the zoning gotten out of the way so that if this area developed, regardless of what's there, even if it's on Franklin and there's a brand new 12-story building, you know, does your zoning allow for this level of intensity of development? And so back of the napkin is that downtown would get pretty close. But you know, we really need the prescriptive method for doing your capacity calculations is a later step, because this work and the reaching out to historically marginalized groups and getting doing the displacement analysis, a lot of that takes a lot more time. So we're really starting with that and doing that citywide and saving the capacity analysis till a little bit later, because downtown probably does get us pretty close, but not quite there. So we want to have all the information before we do that.
well, it just seems that the community has spent a lot of decades, you know, things, nodal development, all of these things that are already in play, have already upzoned areas to with this in mind. So That's why
Yeah.
I'm curious, maybe
Yeah.
I'll go to my next question.
Well, I will just say the first step of the technical analysis was really just looking at zoning and transit corridors. And so it's that existing zoning on the ground. Where do we already have densities that already achieve a climate friendly area or are pretty close and would require fairly small changes? So we have a lot of those options across the city where you would expect, downtown around the university up the transit corridors, kind of following that history of zoning areas.
So that my next question is about the displacement.
Mhm.
And could you give a couple of examples of what strategies might be to mitigate displacement?
Yeah, they're mostly focused on, they're housing production strategies, and they are focused on how we can assure more affordable housing, some capital H affordable housing and some kind of lower all income ranges. So there's a whole menu kind of spreadsheet that the state has given us of options based on the type of neighborhood or community you're looking at. So whether it's a already kind of affordable and more vulnerable community versus a community that's kind of in active gentrification versus a more wealthy, exclusive neighborhood, and different strategies to produce more affordable housing units.
So just to put words in your mouth, the strategy would be to require a redevelopment to include a certain percentage of units that rent or sell for a certain price.
That is one of the options on a very long menu. Mm-hmm.
Good. Do you know another one? Can you share?
Inclusionary zoning, which I think is what you're getting at, is some of them. I'd have to look back at.
Okay, what's inclusionary zoning?
It's similar to what you're getting at of all new development would have to require a certain percentage of capital A income limited affordable housing.
Well, I can imagine that. I just wasn't curious to see if there were strategies for retail or commercial displacement or.
No, and that's a great.
I'm not aware of any, but I thought, well, maybe.
They are all housing focused. That is a great question and something that's come up in our first couple of steps of the displacement analysis is thinking about business displacement. Yeah. And the state doesn't necessarily provide us a list of here you go, here are the strategies, but that doesn't mean we couldn't look at introducing those strategies kind of in conjunction with our designation process.
Melissa?
I'm gonna jump in really quick. And you guys can confirm this. We could do both, right? We could do downtown and more. We could designate enough, beyond what our minimum requirement is. And that might be something we're interested in doing. I haven't even looked at the study. I'm gonna be that honest, but thinking about what Heather was mentioning about how this helps our other projects. So in the housing implementation pipeline, we have goals around housing downtown. This could help us increase, help us meet those goals as well. And then we could also look at other areas. The other thing, on the other hand, I do want to raise that zoning isn't necessarily what causes things to be built. It allows them to be built, but we have had a lot of experience of rezoning areas and then nothing happens. So really it's part of the toolbox, but it's not the only thing. So we could, put CFAs all over, and that doesn't mean that they're all going to develop. So what Leah was mentioning about, coupling those with other tools and other projects is probably where we're going to see more success.
I can't see behind me, so no, here we go.
Okay. So are we moving along here? Okay, great. So again, I'm Rob Interfeld, Transportation Planning Manager in Public Works Engineering. Is this microphone working? Yeah, okay, great. So if you could go to the next slide, please. In 2009, the legislature passed something called the Jobs and Transportation Act, which provided a lot of money to build highways around the state. And one thing that it did that was more, I'd say, advocated for by the land use and environmental community was that it required our metro area, basically the cities and county within the Central Lane Metropolitan Planning Organization area to engage in developing a scenario for reducing greenhouse gas emissions from passenger vehicles. And so an MPO or metropolitan planning area, something that's required by the federal government, to basically do planning to access federal transportation funding for your metro area. Our MPO is called the Central Lane MPO, and it's staffed by the Lane Council of Governments. So at the time, we were required by the Jobs and Transportation Act to develop and select a scenario for reducing our greenhouse gas emissions by about 20%, but not to implement it, just to select it. Next slide, please. So what is it in this context of that Jobs and Transportation Act, what a scenario was, or what scenario planning was strategies to reduce greenhouse gas emissions from passenger vehicles. And so in some cases, when people hear scenario planning, they think about more of the marriage between land use and transportation. But for what we were required to do, it was really focused on the different tools and strategies more on the transportation side. So including, you see the list of categories up there, things like transit, active transportation, pricing, parking, education and marketing, et cetera. So those were the different categories of strategies that were developed in the scenario. And so this scenario that was selected, a lot of the strategies in it are things that we are already doing as a community. And they include things like these. So I'm gonna just read some of the actual strategies that are in the selected scenario from 2015. Building the pedestrian and bicycle projects in our 20-year project list. Dedicating a larger share of local transportation funds to active transportation projects, which is something we did through the bond measure that was passed by Eugene voters last fall. Implementing a bike share program. There's also 7 transit strategies in the selected scenario. For example, support increased frequencies and expanded service hours. And so in general, these strategies in the scenario from 2015 align well with the city's transportation system plan, with the Climate Action Plan 2.0, and with other adopted plans that we have in Eugene. So next slide, please. So this is in terms of the scenario planning that we're required to do now as part of these new CFAC rules, this is a timeline that shows sort of the major steps that we're going to have to go through. So the first thing is that we need, and I'll go in more detail into these in a minute, but the first thing is we need to submit a regional work program. So working with City of Springfield and potentially also Lane County and the City of Coburg to develop a work program. So the current deadline is that we need to submit a preferred scenario to the state by the end of this calendar year, but we're going to request an extra year. And when we submit the work program, that's our opportunity to request changes in the timeline. And then lastly, there's when we actually implement this scenario, is we would do that when we adopt a major update to our TSP. And currently the rule says 2026, we're proposing 2029, and I'll get into that more in a minute. So next slide, please. We're proposing, so this is sort of what's due by this June. And so that's a fixed date. That's not going to change. This shows you what we need to include in this regional work program. And Lane County and Coburg can potentially opt out of this process. I think they're going to not opt out, but they might. So that's why we're not totally sure, but definitely we'll be working with the City of Springfield. We're really appreciative too that the state is paying Lane Council of Governments to support this whole process. And also there'll be additional consulting firms involved providing technical support. And we're proposing to use the MPC, the Metropolitan Policy Committee, which is the intergovernmental body that is the policy board for the Central Lane MPO. We're proposing to use that body also as the governance structure for the scenario planning. However, there's kind of a few different versions of the MPC, and this would be the MPC meeting in sort of a non-federal role. I can get into more detail in that if there are questions. So LCOG is going to be working with us to develop these different elements that you see here. There was quite a bit of community engagement that went into this scenario that we adopted in 2015. And I'll go into it more in a minute, but we don't anticipate doing a large amount of community engagement for this process. So next slide, please. Thank you. So we're required, basically the state wants us to use the scenario from 2015. And to be really honest, like one of the reasons is that they didn't have the budget to fund a full-fledged scenario planning process in the Eugene Springfield metro area. So they, in Salem, Kaiser, they're going to be doing a full-fledged land use and transportation scenario. But what they want us to do here is to use the scenario that was selected in 2015, make some tweaks to it as needed, and then develop these additional measures that you see up on the screen, which are performance measures, equity performance measures, and just setting up a reporting process for that. So that's what we're looking at doing by, the date that we're proposing is to change that to the end to December 31st, 2024. One thing to note is that we're not required to adopt the scenario by then. We're just required to tell the state what our selected scenario is, including the policies, strategies, and performance measures. And then the performance measures and other elements of the scenario will be officially adopted when we adopt a major update to our TSP. And that's how the rules are laid out. That's how they want us to do this process. Okay, next slide, please. So you may be wondering, like, well, why are we proposing to push the TSP out to 2029? And again, the state has funding to basically to pay for consultants for our major TSP update. And they originally had anticipated being able to provide the funding in order for us to do that by 2026. And now they're saying, no, we're not going to have that capacity until aiming for a 2029 adoption for your TSP. I think part of it too is just the consulting firms in the state and what capacity they have, the consulting firms that have experience working with communities to develop transportation system plans. So that's why we anticipate requesting that the TSP deadline be pushed back to 2029 to sync up with that. We can make minor TSP updates before then. In fact, but we wouldn't have to make a major like full-fledged TSP update until 2029. Just one quick aside is that we're going through a process right now called Move Huge for programming the approximately $13 million from the bond measure. They're allocated to walking, biking, and safety projects. And we've just kicked off a public process for that. Some of the work that Leah was talking about earlier, where transportation was collaborating with the planning division, included talking to different disadvantaged communities about the Move Huge process. And there's other things we're doing too for that. And we're using Move Huge not just to program the bond measure funds, but also to update the pedestrian and bicycle project lists in the transportation system plan, because we've actually built a lot of those projects already or have funding for them. And then some we've maybe realized aren't the right type of infrastructure for that street or corridor. So we're going to update the project list in the TSP, and then we can decide like when do we want to actually do the adoption process for that. So that might be a minor TSP update. We're also asking the community, like, what are about other things we can do to reduce reliance and encourage more on single passenger autos and encourage more people to use walking, biking, and public transportation as ways to get around. So I think the Move Huge work we're doing and asking those kinds of questions, I think syncs up really well with the strategies and policies in the scenario planning. I think that's it. Is there another slide? The next steps. So we're working with LCOG and our other regional partners to develop this governance structure. We'll probably be doing a city council work session as well. So the city council is apprised of this and making sure they have an opportunity to provide any direction, submit the work program in June, and then, just doing that more technical work with our partner agencies and then the consulting firm that is brought on board to help develop those performance measures. So be happy to take any questions and interested in any comments that you have. Mr. Howard.
With my mic. Thank you, Rob. My question, you mentioned kind of some coordination with other municipalities, cities, Springfield and Lane County potentially. I'm curious if there are misaligned deadlines with the different cities on this component of it, if that impacts things. I mean, I know we got some extensions, and then you mentioned a point at which you ask for that deadline in in this process. I don't know if I'm making sense, but if the deadlines aren't aligned with all of the other partners, I'm curious as to how that impacts how Eugene moves forward.
And you're speaking specifically to scenario planning, right?
Yeah.
I mean, scenario planning is more at the policy and strategy level.
Okay.
So I don't know if there's specific things you have in mind, but I think it's at the policy and strategy level and not at like the detail level of like, is Coburg Road going to have frequent transit service or not? Do you know what I mean? Like
I guess I'm thinking more along the lines of, so I know that the city of Eugene has been extended some deadlines.
Parking.
They requested some extensions just specific to parking. Okay, because
yeah.
as I think about this, okay, well, then maybe it isn't.
Well,
issue.
Go ahead, sorry. Yeah, so I think Rob touched on this. So by June, we have to submit a joint work program for implementing the scenario plan. What's the governance structure, all of those things. And that is with Springfield. And together, we're actually going to be submitting our alternative date request for the other components that are eligible. So we will at the same time Springfield is, and there is some syncing up that's happening because we're using the same consultants for the climate friendly area study. That's non-negotiable anyway, but I mean, we are trying, that deadline's non-negotiable. But we are talking with them. And I think particularly when it comes to transportation, there is a lot of coordination that's going on with deadlines and that sort of thing. So
also the Springfield City Council, my understanding is they've already provided direction to staff to work through the MPC. So they're, they may have some other concerns about CFBC writ large, but they are, engaged in scenario planning piece where we're meeting bi-weekly with LCOG and Springfield staff.
Okay.
On this.
Yeah, I'm curious, what's the makeup of the MPC and, I mean, are there some guidelines for developing the governance structure, who sits on it, so forth, so on?
I think the state's looking specifically for the bodies that will be adopting this, which is Eugene, Springfield, potentially Lane County and Coburg, as being part of that governance structure. Now, of course, we need to work with LTD. I think they're pretty instrumental to how successful this is, but the question is how to engage them, whether they need to be part of that governance structure or not. The MPC, when it meets for the MPO purposes, includes 2 representatives from Eugene, Springfield, Lane County, LTD, 1 representative from Coburg, representative from Oregon Department of Transportation. But then there's some other iterations of the MPC, for example, as the Cable Commission for our metro area. And there's another version of the MPC that's just Eugene, Springfield, and Lane County that has to do with resolving land use disputes. So we're anticipating there will be another version of MPC that would meet specifically for this purpose. And so Mayor Venus and Councilor Groves are the city of Eugene's representatives to the MPC.
So I guess my question is a little bit of a dovetail on what Commissioner Harris was going at. Did you say earlier that if we don't submit this plan, that we would be denied access to federal transportation dollars on projects?
No, I did not say that.
So in other words, it's not a precursor to having.
It has no impact on that. The state of Oregon can't regulate the federally designated MPO in that way.
Maybe it was off.
Well, there was talk about, if we didn't use the 2015 scenario plan, the state doesn't have additional funding for us to redo our plan. So that might have been, I don't know if that's what it was in reference to, but they basically said, we're not saying you can't redo it, but we don't have the funding to support, because they already supported it once, the 2015 plan, so.
Got it, okay. Okay.
I have one.
Sorry.
Thank you. I want to say thank you very much for all of this that you put together. I'm remembering in August, you guys always do a very high level standard of work. You do. But I'm remembering in August, it felt like kind of statewide as I was following it, and the rule was coming down pretty fast. There were municipalities around that were challenging this. I found this time when I go through the backgrounder of the AIS and I listen to the presentation, everything feels really well organized. I mean, you clearly kind of have it kind of under control. I know there are levels and layers of questions and issues here, and there's a lot of work remaining to be done, but it feels to me like you've got it all under control. One of the things I particularly like is the way that you framed it, kind of right out of the chute in the AIS, and the way it feels to me like it's kind of portrayed on the website, that all of this work coming about because of this rule is right straight in alignment with policies and plans the city of Eugene has been doing for years. And I think, you know, emphasizing that point, continuing to emphasize it in a number of these different initiatives we work on is good. But I just think that makes a lot of sense. I think it's obviously true. This, in a way, it kind of represents a vehicle. I don't know what the best term is, but a way to help us as a city continue to kind of bring to fruition these plans, these policies and so on. So I just appreciate the way that you put it together and how we're proceeding. Thanks.
Thanks, Fred. Okay. Next item on our agenda is items for commission and staff. Are there any items or information that either would like to share?
I always have stuff to share, but before I do that, let you all, if there's anything. Okay. I'll just jump in. I am thrilled to let you all know that Urban Reserves was adopted today. Last night it went through council. It was voted to be adopted by council last night, and then the Board of Commissioners had a unanimous vote this afternoon. So that is very thrilling news. So thank you for your participation in that. You definitely made it a stronger package, and they didn't make any changes to the Planning Commission recommendations. So that's really outstanding. So thank you. And then just in terms of upcoming meetings for you all, your next meeting is on the 25th, and that is fully virtual. Right now, what's scheduled is deliberations for Goshen. There's a possibility that's going to bump out. So I'm just giving you a heads up on that. And we may have a replacement item instead, but I'll keep you posted. And then in early May, so on the 9th, is the River Road Santa Clara Neighborhood Plan update that will be in here, so hybrid. We're still working on the 23rd. And then as Reed mentioned, in June, it's going to be parking. So that will be fun. And then just kind of what's coming up for the city council next Wednesday, the planning and development department has a council work session on our full work plan. And then also to talk about neighborhood planning and potentially what plan should come next, or what planning effort should come next. The city manager will be has a work session about the budget on the 26th, so the following Wednesday, and I'll send you information as I get more information on the budget. And then also, just as a FYI, on May 10th, Gabe and team will be going on the Greenway. There'll be a work session on the Greenway in advance of a June public hearing. And then just kind of one more FYI, and I will send this to you. And the city has launched a website from our city staff that are on the intertribal government relations team. And it's got some education and resources about land acknowledgement. Also will help all of us have the correct pronunciations. I thought I knew how to say some of them right. Turns out I didn't. And so I actually, Commissioner Bailing had asked for resources on that, and we didn't have any available. Now we do. So I will be sure to send you all that website. And I think that's all I have, and happy to answer any questions.
Ms. Sherwin?
Thank you. Could you tell me where the council is? Is this Eugene City Council, have they voted yet on the urban reserves? Or-
Yeah. They did
Okay.
last night, sorry, so.
Oh, it
yeah,
was,
so
okay.
our council voted, they adopted last night,
Okay.
and so it had to be a joint adoption. And so the board.
That's
um,
what piece I didn't.
Yes, so sorry, yeah,
Thank you.
council last night, Board of County Commissioners today, meaning they've both adopted identical ordinances and go in effect soon.
Great. Rebecca.
Yeah, when does the budget process start and when people can provide input during public testimony? Do you-
I can send you that information. I don't have it off the top of my head. April and May for sure.
Right.
There are definitely budget committee. We were just looking at that calendar. I don't have it don't have it right at my fingertips, but I will make a note to send you that information.
Okay, great. Thank you.
Yeah.
Well, this meeting of the Planning Commission is now adjourned. Thanks.